It was a grand day at the royal palace, with banners fluttering in the wind and the air filled with the sounds of excited chatter. The event was one of the most important gatherings of the year, where the royal family would interact with the public and dignitaries. The guests were dressed in their finest attire, and everyone knew that this event would be remembered for years to come. Among the many guests was the royal family, all of whom carried themselves with an air of dignity. But today all eyes were on the youngest member of the family, Princess Charlotte. Her presence seemed to brighten the entire room, though she was still a child. Her wide-eyed curiosity and playful energy made her stand out among the formalities of the day. Despite being young, she was aware of the expectations surrounding her. As she looked around, she couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and excitement. The grand hall was a sight to behold. The floor beneath the guests' feet was polished to perfection, and the walls were adorned with tapestries that told the stories of past royal events. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, and the soft murmur of the crowd filled the space with a sense of quiet anticipation. In the midst of all this, there was one constant. Standing at attention as he had been trained to do was the royal guard. The guard was a towering figure, dressed in his ceremonial uniform. His posture was straight and unwavering, and his eyes scanned the room with practiced precision. He was a symbol of protection, the silent guardian who ensured that the royal family remained safe and secure. But despite his stoic appearance, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of humanity beneath the disciplined exterior. For years he had stood in the same spot at countless events, always doing his duty, never allowing anything to distract him from his post. Today, however, was different. There was an energy in the air, a shift in the usual routine. The young princess, dressed in a beautiful gown, stood among her family. She wasn't quite old enough to understand the full gravity of the event, but she could feel the eyes on her. The royal family was often in the spotlight, but today it seemed that everyone was especially focused on the princess. As the events unfolded around her, she observed the way the adults spoke to one another, their words polite and careful, each one weighed with meaning. It all felt so formal, so precise, but Charlotte was a child, and she couldn't help but fidget, wanting to explore the world beyond the stiff conversations. She stood next to her parents, her gaze drifting toward the royal guard. His posture was impeccable, his eyes fixed on a distant point, unwavering. There was a certain stillness to him that made him almost blend into the background, like a statue, a piece of the palace itself. But Charlotte's attention was fixed on him, and she couldn't help but wonder about this tall, silent figure standing so rigidly by her side. As she watched him, a thought crossed her mind. She didn't know exactly why, but something told her that this man, this guard, was more than just a statue. Perhaps in his quiet stillness there was something more, something she could learn about. She had seen the way the adults around her looked at the guard with respect and sometimes even awe. It was clear that he held a position of importance, but to Charlotte, he was just another part of the scene, until that moment. Something in the air seemed to shift. The guard for a fleeting moment glanced in her direction. It wasn't much, just a brief flicker of movement in his eyes, but Charlotte noticed. She could tell that he had seen her. It was a small, seemingly insignificant moment, but to her it felt like a spark. Her curiosity got the better of her. The princess, with her playful nature, decided to experiment. She had no idea what would happen, but she was determined to try something. She had seen how the adults in the room were following the rules, speaking carefully and maintaining an air of decorum. But here, with the guard in front of her, she felt a sense of adventure rising within her. Charlotte waited for a quiet moment, when no one was paying attention to her. Then, with a small gesture, she gave a tiny wave of her hand, almost like a secret signal. It wasn't obvious, just a small movement, but it was enough to catch the guard's eye. The gesture was deliberate, a signal meant only for him. And in that moment, Charlotte felt a connection, something unspoken but real. The royal guard, ever vigilant, caught the movement from the corner of his eye. He was trained to observe every detail, to notice the smallest of changes. But this was different. He had seen hundreds of guests pass by, each one following the expected script, each one behaving in a way that adhered to the formalities of the day. But Charlotte's tiny signal was something else entirely. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but it was clear that this wasn't just a random movement. It was a signal, but why? And what did it mean? His training told him to stay alert, to maintain his position, to follow the rules. But in that moment, something in him hesitated. There was a bond, an unspoken understanding that passed between him and the young princess. For a split second, he wondered if this was some sort of test or perhaps a request for help. But from where he stood, he couldn't be sure. The grand event continued around them, but the moment between the guard and the princess lingered in the air. Charlotte, unaware of the complexity of the situation, waited for his response. She didn't know what she expected, but she was sure that whatever happened next would be something worth remembering. The royal guard stood still, his thoughts racing. He had always adhered to the protocols, the rules that had been drilled into him from the moment he joined the service. But now, faced with the innocence of a young princess and the quiet request she had made, he was torn. Should he ignore it and continue standing as he always had? Or should he acknowledge the signal and break from his usual role? For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to fade away. The crowd's chatter grew quieter in his mind, and the only thing he could focus on was the young princess, her innocent gesture, and the questions swirling in his mind. What was she asking of him? What did this mean? But before he could dwell on it too much, the moment passed. The princess, sensing that the guard had not reacted, turned her attention elsewhere. But in the silence between them, something had changed. It was a fleeting moment, one that few would ever notice, but it had occurred. And in that moment, something had shifted in both of them. A quiet connection that would leave an impression far beyond the walls of the grand palace. The royal event continued on, but for the guard, something felt different. He had been trained to follow orders, to remain disciplined, to never stray from the script. But what if the script wasn't always the most important thing? What if in this moment something else mattered? He didn't know yet, but he couldn't help but wonder. The day carried on, with the royal family continuing their conversations and meeting with various guests. But in the back of the royal guard's mind, something lingered. The subtle signal from Princess Charlotte was still fresh in his thoughts, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't like him to question his duties or step outside the established norms. His job was clear: protect the royal family, ensure the event ran smoothly, and never deviate from the rigid protocols that governed every aspect of royal gatherings. But today, something felt different. The grand hall was still buzzing with the activity of the event. The chandeliers above glittered with light, casting soft glows across the polished floor. Guests moved about in their finest attire, exchanging pleasantries and enjoying the carefully planned moments of entertainment. The music played softly in the background, adding an air of elegance to the room. In the midst of this organized chaos, the princess sat among her family, an innocent smile on her face as she observed the world around her. She looked out at the crowd with wide eyes, curious about everything, yet unaware of the responsibility and expectations that lay upon her. For a moment, the royal guard tried to refocus. He reminded himself that he was there to keep watch, to stand as a silent protector for the family he had sworn to defend. But his mind kept drifting back to that brief, almost unnoticeable hand gesture from the princess. He had been trained to look for threats, to react to danger, to keep the royal family out of harm's way. But now, for the first time, he found himself wondering about the deeper meaning of the moment. What had Charlotte intended by that signal? What was she asking of him? The princess had done nothing that most would consider unusual. In fact, her actions were the very definition of innocent curiosity. She had simply waved her hand, a small secret gesture meant only for him. But in that instant, the guard felt the weight of her unspoken request. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke to him on a level he had never experienced before. He had always seen the royal family as figures to be revered and protected, but now with this simple, quiet exchange, the boundaries between protector and protected seemed to blur. He could see Charlotte, still sitting quietly among her family, her attention shifting between the ongoing conversations and the people around her. She looked like any other child, innocent and unaware of the world of formality that surrounded her. Yet there was something in her gaze, something that made her seem more mature than her years. The princess wasn't just part of the royal family. She was also a person, a young girl with her own thoughts and feelings, even if those thoughts were still simple and carefree. It was then that the guard noticed something he hadn't before. As the event progressed, Charlotte's small gestures and expressions were far more meaningful than he had given them credit for. She wasn't just a royal figurehead. She was learning, growing, and trying to make sense of the world around her. He couldn't help but admire her curiosity. While the adults in the room conducted their discussions with great seriousness, Charlotte observed everything with an open heart. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the formality that often defined the royal environment. As the day went on, the guard's mind continued to return to the moment of their silent exchange. He stood in his usual spot, watching over the event, but now his awareness was heightened. He found himself watching the princess more closely, noticing how she seemed to withdraw into herself at times, perhaps overwhelmed by the weight of the event. She would look up, catching his eye for a brief moment, and then turn her attention back to her family or the room around her. It was clear that Charlotte wasn't entirely comfortable with the formality of it all. As the youngest member of the royal family, she was still learning how to navigate the expectations placed upon her. Her natural curiosity was often tempered by the understanding that there were limits to how she could behave, but every now and then she would let her guard down, showing glimpses of the child she was, the child who could not fully grasp the significance of the grand event taking place around her. For the guard, this realization brought a new sense of empathy. He had always been trained to see the royal family as figures of importance, people whose every word and action carried weight. But now he was beginning to see them differently. He was starting to understand that beneath the royal titles and expectations, they were human beings just like everyone else. And in that moment, he began to recognize Charlotte's vulnerability. She wasn't just the future of the monarchy. She was a child, still figuring out where she fit in the world. As the afternoon wore on, the royal guard continued his silent vigil, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. He remained vigilant as he always did, but his focus had shifted. The events of the day were still unfolding, but now his attention was drawn to the princess. He found himself observing her more intently, noticing the subtle shifts in her expression, the way she interacted with her family, and the way she seemed to retreat into her own thoughts at times. It wasn't that he had never seen the princess before. He had been stationed at many royal events in the past, but today felt different. Today there was a connection between them, however fleeting it may have been, that made him see her in a new light. And as the day continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Perhaps it was the weight of the moment, the subtle bond they had shared in that brief instant. But the guard couldn't help but feel that there was more to this day than met the eye. As Charlotte's gaze occasionally met his, the guard found himself wondering what she was thinking. Did she recognize him as someone she could trust? Or was she simply a child, unaware of the significance of their interaction? Whatever the case, he knew one thing for certain. He had been changed by the brief moment they shared. It wasn't just about the duty he had sworn to uphold. It was about something deeper, something that connected them in a way he hadn't anticipated. As the event moved toward its conclusion, the royal family began to gather together, preparing to leave. The guests began to filter out of the hall, and the atmosphere shifted from one of formal excitement to one of quiet anticipation. The event was drawing to a close, but the moment between the guard and the princess was still very much alive in his mind. Charlotte stood, ready to leave with her family, but for a brief moment, she turned to look at the guard once again. Their eyes met for the briefest of seconds, and in that exchange, the princess gave him another small smile. It was a quiet gesture, but it carried a weight that words could not express. The guard nodded imperceptibly in return, his heart swelling with a sense of understanding. He had been assigned to protect her, but now in this quiet moment, it felt like something far more meaningful had occurred. With the event winding down, the guard stood tall once again, resuming his usual position. He watched as the royal family exited the hall, Charlotte among them, her small figure walking alongside her parents. But as she passed by him, she glanced over her shoulder once more, her eyes meeting his in a moment of shared understanding. It was a fleeting exchange, one that would be forgotten by most, but for the guard, it was something that would stay with him long after the event was over. As the last of the guests filed out of the hall, the royal guard remained standing, watching over the palace with the same unwavering commitment he had always had. But deep down, he knew that the connection he had felt that day was something that would never be forgotten. The princess had given him a glimpse into a world beyond protocol, beyond duty. And in that moment, he had glimpsed something truly human, a bond that transcended the roles they had been assigned, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful connections happen in the quietest of moments. The following days after the event at the palace carried on as usual, with the royal guard returning to his routine duties. But the encounter with Princess Charlotte lingered in his mind, in ways he hadn't expected. Every time he stood at attention, his thoughts drifted back to the quiet moment they had shared. It wasn't just the signal she had given him that day. It was the connection, the feeling that he was no longer just a protector but also a silent witness to something much more human. Each day brought with it the usual demands of his role: security checks, drills, and maintaining his disciplined presence at various events. His duties were clear, and he took pride in them. But something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he could feel it in the way he viewed his responsibility now. The princess, despite her young age, had reminded him of the fragility of life, the way even those in positions of power could still have moments of vulnerability. And perhaps, just maybe, it had reminded him that there was more to his role than simply following orders. The guard had always been aware of the importance of his post. He understood the weight of his responsibilities, to ensure that nothing could disrupt the royal family's safety and peace. His training was rigorous, and he had long been prepared for the moments when duty called, when danger loomed, and when his role was clear. Yet nothing in his training had prepared him for the quiet, almost unspoken exchange that had taken place that day with Charlotte. No manual could have taught him how to respond to that. He couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in his mind. Her gesture had been so small, so subtle, yet it had been enough to pull him from his usual composure. What had she meant by it? Why had she made that signal so innocently, as if she expected him to understand? And why in turn had he felt compelled to acknowledge it, to take action? Days passed and the palace life resumed. There were more events to attend, more royal appearances, and more moments of quiet reflection as he stood in his post, watching over the royal family. But this time his eyes would often drift toward Charlotte. He observed her more closely now, not just as a figure of royalty but as a child, one who was trying to make sense of a world filled with so many rules, so many expectations. He watched as she moved through the halls, her small steps echoing softly against the palace floor, her eyes wide with curiosity. The princess was growing up, and he could see it. She was no longer the little girl who seemed so unaware of the world around her. Instead, she was beginning to understand the weight of her name, the importance of her role. But even in the midst of this realization, there was a part of her that still clung to her innocence, to her ability to see the world in ways that no one else could. She was still a child at heart, and that was something that he couldn't help but admire. Yet despite his growing admiration for the young princess, there was a part of him that remained distant. He was still a royal guard, and his duty was clear. He could not let himself become too personally involved, too emotionally invested. His job was to protect, to serve, and to remain detached from the personal lives of those he was sworn to protect. But even so, the pull of that connection, of the quiet understanding that had passed between him and Charlotte, remained. One afternoon, as the royal family gathered for another formal event, the guard found himself once again stationed in his usual spot. His eyes scanned the room, his attention sharp and unwavering, but he couldn't help but notice how different the princess seemed this time. She wasn't as playful as she had been before. There was a new seriousness in her demeanor, a quiet awareness of the world around her. She was still a child, yes, but it was clear that she was beginning to feel the weight of her responsibilities. Charlotte stood with her family, her small frame barely visible among the taller figures. She was quietly observing the guests, her eyes flitting from one conversation to the next. For a moment, the guard couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She was still so young, yet already she had to navigate a world that required her to behave with decorum, to act as a futu, leader, to embody the dignity and grace expected of her. He could see how hard she was trying to fit into this world, to play her part. There were no moments of carefree laughter, no signs of the mischievous spirit that had once defined her. Instead, there was a quiet maturity in her posture, a stillness in the way she carried herself. It was as if she had already understood the gravity of her position and the pressure that came with it. The guard's heart softened at the sight. He had always admired the strength of those around him, the royal family, the dignitaries, the other guards. But in that moment, He realized that the true strength wasn't always visible in the confident strides of the leaders or the unwavering discipline of his fellow officers. Sometimes, it was in the quiet resilience of someone who had not yet fully learned the weight of the world they would one day carry. For the first time, he found himself wishing he could offer the princess something more. He wished he could reassure her that it was okay to be a child, that it was okay to step away from the formality of it all, just for a moment. He wished he could tell her that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. But he knew that was not his place. He was here to protect her, to ensure that no harm came to her or her family. That was all he could do. As the event unfolded, Charlotte seemed more distant than before. She had retreated inwardly, her face a mask of composure as if she were rehearsing for a role she wasn't quite sure how to play. Her small hands clutched the edges of her gown, her gaze fixed on the floor. It was clear that the princess was still learning how to navigate this world of expectations, a world where every move was scrutinized, every word weighed. The guard, ever watchful, couldn't help but notice the sadness in her eyes. He had seen it before in the faces of those who were forced to grow up too quickly, who were burdened with responsibilities beyond their years. There was a quiet loneliness there, a sense of isolation that spoke volumes. He knew that the royal family was always surrounded by people, but he also knew that this kind of isolation wasn't something anyone could escape, no matter how many people surrounded them. It was then that the guard made a decision. He couldn't take away her burdens, couldn't ease the weight of her responsibilities, but perhaps in his small way he could offer her something simple, something that would remind her that, for all the formality of the world she lived in, there was still room for humanity, for kindness, for connection. As the event continued, the guard's eyes met Charlotte's once more. This time there was no signal, no gesture. But in the brief exchange of gazes, the guard saw something in the princess's eyes, a fleeting moment of recognition, of understanding. It was a subtle, silent acknowledgement that, despite the rules, despite the expectations, they were both human. They both had moments of vulnerability. They both needed something more than just duty. The princess gave him a small smile, a fleeting moment of connection that spoke volumes. And in that moment, the guard knew that, no matter how many protocols he followed, no matter how many rules he adhered to, there would always be room for the quiet moments that reminded them both of the humanity that lay beneath the surface. As the event came to an end, Charlotte's smile faded and she returned to her family's side. But for the guard, the connection they had shared would not be forgotten. He had seen something in her that day, a strength born not from power or authority but from the quiet, resilient spirit of a young girl who was still learning how to navigate the world around her. The princess had reminded him of the importance of humanity, of the quiet moments that could make all the difference. And in that realization, the guard found a new sense of purpose in his duty. He would continue to protect the royal family, yes, but he would also remember that sometimes the smallest gestures, the quietest connections, could have the most profound impact. The days continued to blend together for the royal guard, each one a repetition of the last. His routines, his vigilance, and his focus remained the same. Yet something inside him had changed. He had always prided himself on his ability to stand apart from the rest of the world, to remain objective and steadfast in his duties. But ever since that quiet moment with Princess Charlotte, the rigid walls he had built around himself had begun to crack. His thoughts, once dominated by the weight of duty and the strict protocols he was bound to follow, now contained an unexpected softness. He found himself reflecting more on his role, and on the connections he had made with the people he had sworn to protect. The princess's small gesture had shown him something important about the nature of connection, about the humanity that existed even in the most formal of settings. And for the first time, he found himself questioning the true nature of his role. Was he just a silent protector, standing guard over royalty? Or was there something more to his duty, something more personal, something that couldn't be defined by rules and regulations? The royal family continued to carry out their public appearances, and Charlotte, though still young, seemed to be adjusting to the formalities that surrounded her. But the guard noticed a shift in her behavior. She had started to withdraw even more into herself, a sense of quiet burden growing in her demeanor. There were moments when she seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant, as if she were trying to process the world around her, trying to reconcile her role with the innocence of her age. It wasn't that she seemed unhappy exactly. But there was a weight to her presence now, something that hadn't been there before. The carefree playfulness that had once defined her had been replaced with a quiet awareness. She was still a child, still learning, but she had begun to understand the gravity of the situation in which she found herself. She was growing up quickly, faster than most children her age, and the pressure of that reality was starting to show. The guard saw it clearly now. The princess was burdened with more than just the weight of being a royal. She was carrying the expectations of an entire nation, the responsibility of an institution. She had been born into this life, yes, but she had never asked for it. She had never asked to be the center of attention, to carry the legacy of her ancestors, to one day step into a role that would require her to be more than just a child, and yet, that was exactly what was expected of her. As he stood by his post, watching the princess interact with her family, the guard couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sympathy for her. He had seen the way she tried to fit into the mold that had been created for her, the way she attempted to behave with the dignity and composure that everyone expected of her. It was clear that she was trying her best, but he could see the strain in her eyes. There were moments when she seemed to struggle with the expectations placed upon her, moments when she longed for something simpler, something that didn't involve the weight of the crown, and then, just as he was lost in thought, something unexpected happened. As if she had read his mind, the princess's gaze found him once again. This time there was no gesture, no hand movement, no signal. Just a quiet look, a simple meeting of eyes that seemed to speak volumes. Her expression was no longer the carefree curiosity he had seen in the past. Now there was something more, a silent plea, a question without words. It was as if she was asking him for something, but what exactly? He wasn't sure. The guard's heart tightened at the sight. He had always been trained to remain impassive, to never let emotion cloud his judgment, but in that moment he felt something stir within him. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't sympathy in the usual sense. It was a deep, instinctive understanding of the burden that the young princess was carrying. For the first time, he saw her not just as a royal figure, but as a child who was struggling to make sense of her world. And in that moment he realized just how much she needed someone to see her for who she truly was, not just for what she represented. It was in that brief exchange that the guard made a decision. He couldn't protect her from the responsibilities that weighed on her shoulders, nor could he shield her from the harsh realities of her life as a royal. But perhaps in his own way he could offer her something that she couldn't find in the royal palace or in the eyes of the adults who surrounded her. He could offer her understanding. He could offer her a moment of quiet connection, a brief respite from the pressures she faced. It was small, it was subtle, but it was something. It was something he could do, something that went beyond his official duties. As the event continued, the guard stood at attention, but his thoughts were no longer consumed by the usual worries of his role. Instead, he found himself watching Charlotte more closely, his attention drawn to her in a way it hadn't been before. She was still the princess, still the future heir to the throne, but now, she was also something more. She was a child trying to navigate a world that was too big for her, trying to make sense of the expectations and the responsibilities that had been placed on her shoulders. He knew that. In the grand scheme of things, his role was simple. He was there to protect, to ensure that nothing disrupted the royal family's safety and dignity. But now he saw that protection extended beyond just the physical. It was about understanding the emotional and psychological burdens that the young princess was carrying, the invisible weight that came with being part of a family that was constantly in the public eye. The day wore on, and the event began to wind down. The royal family prepared to leave, and the guests started to filter out of the hall. But as they made their way toward the exit, Charlotte turned once more to look at the guard. Their eyes met again, and this time it wasn't a fleeting glance. It was something more, something that held the weight of all the unspoken words that had passed between them. There was a quiet understanding, a silent bond that had formed in the space between them, and for the first time, the guard felt a sense of peace. Charlotte gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they had shared. It was nothing grand, nothing that could be seen or understood by anyone else in the room. But for the guard, it was everything. In that moment, he understood that sometimes the most powerful moments of connection were the quietest, the ones that didn't require words or grand gestures. Sometimes the simple act of understanding, of acknowledging each other's humanity, was enough. As the royal family exited the hall, the guard returned to his post, his mind calm, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He had always known that his duty was to protect, to ensure the safety of those he had sworn to serve. But now he realized that protection wasn't just about keeping danger at bay. It was about seeing the people he protected for who they were, understanding their needs and offering them something more than just security. The princess had given him that gift. And in return, he had offered her something simple but meaningful: understanding. In that quiet moment, he had realized that sometimes, even the smallest of gestures could make all the difference. The days following the royal event were quiet, at least on the surface. The grand palace resumed its usual routines. Guests arrived and departed, meetings were held, and the royal family continued to attend their public duties. But for the royal guard, things had changed. There was a new awareness in his mind, something that had been awakened by the quiet moments shared with Princess Charlotte. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was there, an understanding that his role, once so rigid and clear-cut, was more complex than he had ever imagined. Standing at his post, he couldn't help but reflect on the moments that had passed. He had always thought of his duty as simple. He was there to protect the royal family, to ensure their safety, and to follow the rules without question. But after his interaction with Charlotte, he began to see things differently. Protection wasn't just about physical security. It was also about emotional support, about understanding the humanity of those you were sworn to guard. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little of that had been part of his training. The protocols, the drills, the endless hours of standing at attention, they were all about security. But none of it taught him how to truly understand the people he was protecting. And then there was the princess. Charlotte had shown him something he hadn't expected, a glimpse of vulnerability in someone who was expected to be untouchable, someone who seemed to bear the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Despite her youth, she had been forced into a position of responsibility that most adults couldn't imagine. The eyes of the nation were on her, the expectations were high, and the burden of her future hung heavy in the air. But in their brief exchanges, Charlotte had allowed him to see beyond the title, beyond the royal family, to the child within. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he admired her strength. It wasn't the strength that came from power or position. It was the strength of someone who, despite the odds, continued to move forward. She was just a child, yet she had already learned to navigate a world that could be both beautiful and unforgiving. And in his own small way, the guard had come to understand that he could be a part of that world. Not just as a silent observer, but as someone who could offer her the understanding she needed. But of course, his role hadn't changed. He was still the royal guard, and his duties remained the same. He still stood at attention during the events, still remained vigilant, still ensured that the royal family was safe from harm. But now, when he looked at Charlotte, he saw more than just the future heir to the throne. He saw a child, a human being with her own fears, hopes and dreams, trying to make sense of a world that often felt too big for her. The guard knew that he could never fully understand what it was like to walk in her shoes. He had been born into a different world, one where his role was already set for him, one where he didn't have to carry the weight of the expectations placed on Charlotte. But he had come to understand that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, the quietest gestures, could make all the difference, and that was something he could offer her. As time went on, the guard's interactions with the royal family remained cordial but professional. He continued to stand watch, his focus unwavering as ever, but every now and then he would catch a glimpse of Charlotte, and in those fleeting moments he would remember the quiet bond they had shared. She had never asked for his help, never spoken a word of thanks, but in her eyes he had seen something deeper than gratitude. He had seen an understanding, a recognition of the quiet role he played in her life. One day, as the royal family gathered for another event, the atmosphere in the palace felt different. It wasn't anything that could be seen, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The guests moved through the halls, speaking in hushed tones as though the entire world were holding its breath. And in the midst of all the activity, Charlotte stood quietly, her gaze distant. For a moment, the guard caught her eye, and he saw that familiar expression, the quiet sadness that had become so much a part of her lately. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him pause. She wasn't asking for anything, not directly. But in that moment, he understood what she needed. It wasn't a grand gesture or a proclamation of support. It was something simpler, something quieter. She needed someone who saw her, really saw her, not just as a princess, but as a person. And for the first time, the guard realized that he had a choice. He could continue to stand by silently, just as he always had, or he could step forward, even in a small way, to offer her the comfort she needed. The choice was clear to him. It wasn't about breaking protocol or defying his duties. It was about recognizing that his role wasn't just to protect from danger. It was also to provide comfort, even if it was just through the simplest of actions. So as the event went on, the guard made his decision. As Charlotte passed by him, he allowed his eyes to meet hers, and this time, there was no distance between them. He didn't have to say anything. There was no need for words. But in that brief moment, he offered her something he hadn't offered before: his understanding. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to Charlotte it was everything. She smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. It was a smile of recognition, of gratitude, and perhaps of reassurance. And for the guard, that was all he needed. As the event came to a close, Charlotte left the room with her family, her smile still lingering on her face. The guard stood at attention, his posture as perfect as ever, but his heart was lighter than it had been in a long time. He had done what he could. He had offered her something simple, something human, and in return, she had given him a smile that told him everything he needed to know. The days continued to pass, but the connection between the guard and the princess remained. It wasn't something that could be seen or measured, but it was real. The guard had come to understand that his role was more than just a protector. It was about being present, about offering something more than just security. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, and offering them the support and understanding they needed to navigate the challenges they faced. Charlotte, for all her strength and resilience, was still just a child. She still had much to learn about the world around her, about the responsibilities she would one day carry. But the guard had come to realize that even in the midst of all the formality and expectations, there was room for humanity. And sometimes it was the quiet moments of connection that mattered most. As he stood by his post, the guard reflected on the journey he had been on. He had started as a silent protector, focused solely on his duty. But now he understood that his duty wasn't just about following orders. It was about seeing the people he protected, understanding their struggles, and offering them something simple but meaningful. And in that understanding, he had found a new sense of purpose. The future of the royal family remained uncertain, as it always did. But the guard had come to realize that in the end, it wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic moments that mattered most. It was the quiet moments, the ones that went unnoticed by most, that held the greatest significance. And as he stood at his post watching over the royal family, he knew that he had played a small but important part in their lives, and that, to him, was enough. As the days passed, the royal guard's sense of purpose deepened. It wasn't just about standing,